Christian parenting.
This is Cynthia Yanoff, and you're listening to Pardon the Mess. Each week we have honest discussions about the ups and downs of parenting and the lessons God is teaching us along the way. It's real, it's fun, and it's biblical. Life is messy. Don't walk the parenting road alone. Guys, so glad you're with us today on Pardon the Mess. I want to make sure before we kick off the show that you're aware of our event coming up. It's called Perfectly Imperfect, and it's a Christian parenting event where we are bringing in some of our very favorite speakers to talk about their parenting journey. What I love is that it's digital and you can listen to it from your house. It's October 23rd and 24th, but the videos will be available through the end of the year. You just need to register and then get ready to be encouraged. We're going to have people speaking in every area, from single parenting to parenting through suffering and loss. I'll be speaking, but there'll also be folks like Jonathan Pitts, the Duck Dynasty crew. There is a lot of really great information and content and people coming your way. So be sure and register. It's October 23rd and 24th, and you can go to mess.perfectlyimperfect.org to register. Again, it's mess.perfectlyimperfect.org, and I will link it in the podcast notes. And so today on the podcast, we have Kayla Stoecklein. And Kayla is a mom to 3. She's an author, she's a speaker. And what I love about Kayla is she's an advocate for mental health. And this comes from a really hard place in her own life. Her husband died by suicide on August 25th, 2018. You may have read about it. He was the pastor of a megachurch in California. And I know I read the letter that she wrote to him after he passed away, and just with tears in my eyes, just realized how brave she was to speak into it. And so she's continued to carry on his legacy, and she's speaking into mental health. And the statistics, there's so many, but the one that always gets me is that 800,000 people die by suicide every year in the world, which means that's one person every 40 seconds. So this isn't a topic we have the luxury of ignoring or not thinking about. It's a hard topic, but a really important one that we discuss both in our own mental health, for those around us, and as we're raising kids. And so Kayla's going to talk to us about what not to say to someone who's grieving, 5 ways to support those who were walking through mental illness, how to be proactive in your own mental health, maybe some of the regrets she's had along the way. She's just got a good, strong word for us, and one that I think we all need to hear, especially as we're in September and Suicide Prevention Month. Let's just be really deliberate and intentional in thinking through this topic. So here we go today with Kayla. Hey, Kayla, welcome to Pardon the Mess.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
I'm so glad to have you here. I was looking at your book. I told you this before we started recording, and I was like, okay, let me skim through some of this. It's been one of those weeks. And then the more I got into it, I'm like, oh gosh, there's just a whole lot of great information here. It's called Fear Gone Wild. And it's really the story of, as most people know if they've read our podcast, that's the story of you and losing your husband to suicide. And it's interesting because this is such a hard topic, I think, to talk about for so many of us, and we want to do it well. And so I just preface this all by saying, if I misspeak or don't do it well, I ask for your grace in that, first and foremost. But second of all, I just am so taken by how well you've been able to speak and represent in this lane, and not even almost 2 years out now, but really from the very beginning, when you really initially had suffered through this loss of your husband, you've really been able to speak into it. And so kind of give us a little bit about what's behind that, what's your passion, your motivation, but then also share with us kind of your story.
Sure. Yeah. So a few years ago, I was living a completely different life. I was living my dream life. I loved my life. I was married to my husband, Andrew. He was the lead pastor of our church. So we were in the trenches of ministry, full-time ministry. I loved being a pastor's wife. I was passionate about being a pastor's wife. I had found my little niches in the church and serving on the women's ministry team and serving in MOPS on Wednesdays and showing up early every Sunday and sitting in the front row and cheering him on. Like, I really loved our life. And then in the fall of 2017, my husband started experiencing panic attacks. And these panic attacks were very debilitating and happening very often. And he really struggled from about October until April of 2018, when he had a massive panic attack that landed him in the hospital. And so it was after that we kind of decided to put him on a sabbatical, and like, we don't know what's going on inside of his bodies. The doctors can't figure out what's going on. Nothing's coming up on the blood work. Like, maybe he just needs to rest. Maybe he just needs to stop. Maybe he just needs a break. So we put him on a sabbatical, and a few weeks into the sabbatical, we were sitting in a psychiatrist's office, and he was diagnosed with depression. And I was shocked. I really was shocked. I really never saw it coming. And my husband was actually relieved to have a diagnosis. He was relieved to finally know what was going on inside of his body and what had been causing these panic attacks that were so debilitating for months. So we started on this new journey with depression. And, I had a little bit of a background. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology. And so I had a basic understanding of kind of what we were up against. But I would say that depression looks so different in real life than it does in a textbook. And it's unpredictable. I didn't know who I was going to get coming out of our bedroom in the morning. I didn't know if my husband would be angry. I didn't know if he would be sad. I didn't know if he would be happy. I didn't know if he would be present or if he would be sleeping all day. Like, every day was different. And I was torn between being caretaker for him and his needs, and then mother to our 3 boys. So that summer we have 3 boys, and they were 2, 4, and 5 when he was sick and walking through depression. So our house was wild and loud, like not the most calm environment to be wrestling with depression.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we were doing everything we knew to do to get him better. So he was seeing a psychiatrist every other week. He was taking medication. We were seeing a therapist together for 2 hours every week. He had gone and spent time in solitude with God by himself. He went and spent time with mentors. We did a 2-week road trip, just the 2 of us. Like, on paper, we were doing everything we knew to do to get him better. He wasn't working. He was resting. And so the doctors actually thought he was getting better. And so they released him to go back to work. And on August 1st, 2018, he hit the ground running. He gave 2 powerful messages on mental illness. He called the series Hot Mess, and he was using his own experience as the example. He talked about depression. He talked about panic attacks. He talked about suicide. He gave out the suicide hotline number. He quoted statistics from the NAMI website. Like, he knew all the facts. He would have known where to go for help. And then headed into the 3rd week, he just had a really awful day. He wasn't fully well. He told our staff and told our family he was at about 65% when he went back to work. He wasn't at 100%. He wanted to ease back into ministry. He wanted to get healthy while he was working. And so it kind of made us take a couple steps back, like, okay, maybe he isn't even at 65%. Maybe he needs more time to rest. Maybe he's not ready to go back to work. And so while we were away from him for a little bit, finding a guest speaker for Sunday, trying to take the next steps for his healing, like maybe an inpatient place is the next right step. We were calling people on the phone. While we were away, he attempted suicide. And we were all so shocked. I mean, it was really, truly the most shocking thing I've ever experienced in my whole entire life. And the team of doctors that was surrounding him, the therapist and the psychiatrist and his wellness doctor, like, they were all shocked too. Really, truly, no one ever saw it coming. And so he was rushed to the hospital. They ran a bunch of tests, and there was nothing that they could do. And so on August 25th, 2018, he passed away. And I was handed a brand new life as a widow and now single mom of 3 young boys. And so it's been in this new life, our story went viral right away. Our story was the sad story on the internet. It was the sad story on social media. My social media blew up. And for me, I wanted to write the story. I didn't want Andrew's life to be defined by the way he died. I wanted his life to be defined by the way he lived. And so I chose to speak. I wrote him a letter just 3 days after he passed away. I wrote him this letter where I said, I'm so sorry. Over and over again, I said, I'm so sorry you felt so alone. I'm so sorry I didn't understand your pain. I'm so sorry you were up against a spiritual warfare battle alone. I'm so sorry. Like, I'm so sorry. This wasn't supposed to happen to you. I'm so sorry. And so I reframed it. Right away, I reframed it. I decided that the suicide wasn't Andrew's fault, and that's not a normal response to suicide. And so I kind of became this mental health advocate overnight because I chose to speak. And so I've just kept writing. I wrote him a series of letters, and I've shared a lot on our family blog, God's Got This, and it all opened doors with publishing companies were reaching out, and authors were reaching out, and agents were reaching out. And so doors just started fleeing open. And it was very obvious to me that God had a bigger plan for this message and that I was called to write a book about it. It was just so clear. I couldn't get away from it. And that's why I wrote it. From the depths of my pain, I wrote that book, and I cried equal tears as there are words. And my hope in writing that from the depths of my pain is that it will reach other people that are sitting in the depths of their pain too, and that they will know that they are not alone.
Mm, 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 mm. There's so much in that, so much that I want to stop and ask you about, but I want to read something out of this letter. And I was one of those who read right after it happened. Like you said, this blew up kind of on social media and everywhere. And I read your open letter to him. And I remember sitting there, and it was with this beautiful picture of your kids, your family, and your boys. And I remember sitting there with tears in my eyes, just reading that and thinking, oh heavens, like, where do you go from here? But you write in the end of this letter, and the whole letter is so beautiful. Everyone needs to grab a copy of the book and read it. But you said, when you're writing, I want to tell you that I'm never going to stop fighting for you. I will continue to tell our community and our world what an amazing man you were. Your name will be honored, and you will be remembered as a hero. You fought the good fight, and I can only imagine the incredible place God has prepared for you when you walk through the gates of heaven. And I'm skipping down a little bit, but for now, I'll continue to live for you. I'll raise our boys to be men of God, just like you were. Your name will live on in a powerful way. Your story has the power to save lives, change lives, and transform the way the church supports pastors. And I just think that's such a beautiful way, like you're talking out of, you're reframing, but also letting the Lord use this for bigger purpose. And that's even hard for me to read now. I don't know if is it still hard for you to hear
I'm
those words?
tearing up as you read that.
I have tears in my eyes too. I remember having tears then, and I read this an hour ago and I had tears in my eyes, and I'm tears in my eyes again reading this. And I think just the way that God gives ministry in places we would never ask for ministry, but the way that you have taken this and said, I'm going to carry on your name for who you are and what the Lord did. And you're doing that so well. And I guess when you say, I don't want anyone to ever feel alone, it just brings to mind the statistics. And I read some of the statistics in your book talking about, it's one place that said there's 17.3 million, or an estimate of that many cases of depression diagnosed each year in the United States.
Yeah, it's the number one illness worldwide.
And 800,000 people die of suicide every year in the world. And you said in your book, you quoted stats that said that's basically one person every 40 seconds. That's really hard to really get a grasp on. And so that's why I'm so thankful that you're speaking into it. But I just want people to listening to this, you're not alone. Those stats tell you you're not alone. This is a really tough topic. You almost talk about how we need to recapture the word suicide. We're scared to talk about it. We don't really want, there's stigmas. We don't want to bring it up. We're worried about what if we say it wrong? What if we don't talk about it? What if we do talk about it and plant ideas? But why is it important that we go in and actually be willing to address this topic and talk about it? And how do we do it better?
I think all the words, suicide, depression, anxiety, I think those words make us feel uncomfortable. For the majority of us, those words make us feel very uncomfortable. We feel ill-equipped. We feel like we don't have the right response. And so we shy away from those conversations instead of being open, instead of leaning in. We tend to walk away and kind of stiff arm those conversations because it just makes us feel uncomfortable. And we don't like pain. We like to avoid pain and discomfort. And so, for me, I was the same way, when my husband was struggling, and there was one time that he mentioned suicide to me, and I share about it in the book. And we were sitting at the kitchen counter late at night, and I was venting my frustrations of the day. And, I felt like a single mom that summer in a lot of ways with the boys. And I was worn out, just 3 little boys are going to wear anybody out. And I was also trying to help my husband. And so as I was venting, his response to me was that he was up in the middle of the night before, and he was working on his staff organization charts and had papers strewn all over the counter, and he thought about killing himself. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget my reaction to his response. My reaction was, Andrew, that is the most selfish thing you could ever do. You would never do that to me and the boys. I completely stiff-armed him. I completely kind of attacked him with my own emotion. And I didn't create any space for him to feel like he could share how he was really doing. I just completely rejected that thought and pushed it off the table. And his response to my reaction was, Kayla, that is not what you say to someone that is struggling with suicidal thoughts. You need to come up with something better to say. And he was completely right. We do. We have to have a better response when it comes to suicide. If someone is brave enough to share that with us, it takes a lot of courage and bravery for someone to open up and tell us that they're struggling with suicidal thoughts. That is a very personal, very intimate thought that the enemy would love for them to keep to themselves. And so it's very brave when they are willing to share. And so if someone is willing to share, it's time to lean in. It's time to talk less. It's time to ask questions. Questions like, do you have a suicide plan? What problem are you trying to solve through suicide? Do you know when or how you would do it? How often do you think about it? It's time to take it seriously. I never asked him about suicide again. I really, truly pushed it off the table and thought that would never happen to him. But it did. And so we have to take it seriously. I wish I would have felt more comfortable with the word suicide. I wish I would have asked him every single day, have you thought about suicide today? That simple question, have you thought about suicide today? I wish I would have told our therapist and the psychiatrist and our family and our friends. I didn't tell anybody and he didn't tell anybody, and it wasn't helpful for any of us.
Yeah.
And so I think just being comfortable with it, being willing to talk about it, and then reaching out for help. I wish I would have called the suicide hotline or texted the crisis text line and just said, hey, my husband said this to me. What should I do? What are the next steps? Like that simple text or that simple phone call would have been so helpful. So there are so many resources out there where we can get more information and we can learn more and grow more. But I think the best thing we can do is just have empathy. And true empathy is when we try to crawl into somebody else's pain and share in their pain with them. When true empathy is practiced, the pain is shared and lifted.
Yeah, yeah. That's there's so much packed into there that is so helpful on how to do this well with people that are struggling. And so you talked in the book, and it kind of caught my attention. It was interesting when you were talking about inviting people into the pain, and on several levels, you talked about how kind of during this time y'all had moved to a different place, to another house behind a gate, like a gated property, because of a threat on a family member. All seemed to make sense, but how that almost was symbolic of the fact that your husband was pulling back, and even you yourself, in some regards, maybe to others, because there was so much pain. And I just wonder, as the spouse, as someone walking through this with someone that's struggling with depression or mental illness, how important is it to invite people into the pain? How would you encourage someone who's walking that road?
It's so lonely. As a loved one who was walking alongside somebody who was struggling, it is so lonely and so hard. The therapist told me that I was co-burdening his depression. And in a lot of ways, I felt that. I would tell him, I feel like I have a little taste of what you're walking through, because it was so isolating and so difficult. And I was with our three kids, and he was the pastor of our church. So we also had that thrown into the mix. So a lot of my close friends that I would have felt comfortable confiding in, he was also their pastor. And so
Yeah.
I felt like I needed to protect him. I felt like I needed to kind of shield him and not let people in too much. And so I had a lot of emotions and a lot of pain that I really just kept to myself and tried to deal with myself. And so my advice, or just my encouragement, not advice, but my encouragement to anybody that's walking alongside somebody who's struggling with mental illness would be to make space for their own mental health. Like they need to create margin, they need to create space, they need to take time for themselves. If they don't take time to fill back up, to fill up their tank, to fill up their reservoir, they will not be able to pour out from a healthy place. And that's where I was at with Andrew. Like I was empty. I was running on empty. My emotions were all over the place. I wasn't able to pour out from a healthy place because I was so exhausted. And so creating space, allowing people into your pain, you have to let people in, even if you feel like it's going to be embarrassing for your loved one or it's going to be shameful for your loved one. Like let that go. Like you need people in, you need people to know what's really going on. True community where you can be yourself, where you can cry, where you can vent your anger, where you can vent your frustrations. And if you're in ministry, maybe it's with friends that are outside the church. I had girlfriends that were outside of the church that I could have totally talked to, and I chose not to. So I wished I would have called people, because we're all surrounded by people that would love to be invited into our pain. Like that's the truth, is that there's so many people that love us that would love to be invited into our pain. And so I think opening the door and letting them in and being willing to be vulnerable, it really helps so much lift up that pain. If when it's practiced correctly, when the empathy is practiced correctly, it really does help lift up that pain and share it. And that's what we're supposed to do for each other, like bear each other's burdens and share each other's pain. And I think we can all do a better job of doing that just in the day to day, but especially when we're walking alongside somebody who's struggling and we're struggling too.
Yeah, yeah. It's so easy, I would think, to feel like you're being a burden, either if you're the person that has the mental health issue or if you're supporting a spouse that you're a burden. But what you're saying right here is like, no, let people in. And yeah, all of us as outsiders looking in are saying, let us help you. And so as we're doing that, I think if there's somebody listening now, and I'm sure there is, everyone at some point deals with anxiety or depression, different angles of that. But you talk about ways to be proactive about your own mental health. I think I'd love for you to talk about that, but also as we're a parenting podcast, I think these are good recommendations to think about with our kids. I want to ask you a couple questions in a minute about walking your kids through this, but what are some proactive steps we need to be thinking out taking for ourselves and then in turn with our kids?
Yeah, I think especially now, during the worldwide pandemic and all of us are isolated, it's hard. Right now in California, there are fires going on. So it is
Mm.
smoky and ashy outside. And my boys are doing virtual learning. So they're in the living room watching YouTube right now, and they can't even go outside and play because it's so ashy and gross outside. And so it's such a hard time, mentally exhausting. We can't even, there's not even places to go that are open to go take them inside somewhere. Like everything's shut down, it's not normal. And so we're all grieving something in this season. It's a heavy season. It's a hard season. And so I would say, it is so important to be proactive about our mental health in this season. And I don't quite remember what I shared in the book. I would have to pull it up, but just off the cuff, I would say that sleep, like getting a full night's sleep, creating room for rest, like getting to bed early. Sleep is and rest is so important. There have been so many times in this season where I've hired a babysitter and booked a hotel room for a couple days just to get away and refuel and rest so that I could keep pouring out for my kids. I would say exercise, even just going for a walk around the neighborhood. I know a lot of gyms are closed and it's hard to even do that, but even going for a walk with your kids or just taking a quick walk around the neighborhood can be so good. I would say, eating healthy. These are like normal things that people know for our mental health, but eating healthy and making sure that we're refueling our body. And then I would say also practicing the spiritual disciplines. Like for me personally with my faith, it's so important for me to fill myself back up. I feel so much more centered and just so much more full when I spend time with God and I spend time reading, books that are refueling and refilling. So reading the scripture, spending time in solitude. I taught there's a whole chapter in the book about solitude and the difference between solitude and isolation, and how isolation is draining and solitude is refueling and refilling. And that solitude time is intentional. It's not time wasted. It's not binging Netflix. It's not scrolling mindlessly through social media. It's intentionally carving out time to sit in contemplation and just sit and be with God and just sit and process life and have some blank white space. And so I think we can all do a better job of just creating margin and creating space for ourselves. And I think it's hard as a single parent. It's like really hard in this season to do that. But it's not impossible to shut off the phone for the day or turn off the email for the day or delete Instagram off your phone for the day, or just get out of the house and go sit at the beach or go sit at the park or go sit somewhere beautiful for the day that's not closed.
Totally. That's so good. That's so good. I'm guessing just by virtue of what you believe in the Lord and knowing his bigger plans and trusting him even in the hard places, the unknown, that you probably try to live in a place where you don't have regrets. But I also know that you, and you've mentioned this in the book too, that you can look back on some ways that you wish you would have done things differently. I think you alluded to some of that earlier, but for someone that's listening that has maybe not handled mental health with their loved ones the best way that they could have, or they wish they would have done it differently, what do you say? How do you speak into that when it comes to regrets?
I would say it's completely normal with suicide. Suicide is a beast. Suicide is so difficult to process. And, right away we're kind of swept away in this sea of regrets, and it's all consuming and you can feel like you're drowning in it for the few months, my mind, the therapist described it as my mind has all these file folders. And because I had never walked through this before, my mind had nowhere to put it. And so it was always at the forefront of my mind until that file folder was created. And so I would constantly, all day, every day, throughout sleeping at night, in my dreams, I was trying to save him. I had so many coulda, woulda, shouldas. If I would have done this, if I could have done that, if I would have responded this way, he should still be here. And my brain kept trying to save him, and it's so exhausting. The best advice I had from somebody in that season was just to give myself an hour like give my brain a break for like an hour every day, just to like shut that down for a minute and like watch a show or try to engage in something else for an hour, just to take a break, because it is so all consuming. And that's just what suicide is. Like, all of us love that person so much that we would have done anything in our power to save them. And what's been so helpful for me with the suicide and the way that my husband died is to really, truly, at the end of the day, I have all those regrets. I'm doing a lot better today than, 2 years ago. But at the end of the day, when I have those spirals and when I think about that, reminding myself that the suicide isn't anybody's fault. It's not Andrew's fault. It's not my fault. It's not the medication's fault. It's not the doctor's fault. Like, it's not anybody's fault. It's an absolute tragedy. It should not have happened, and no one is to blame.
Those are powerful words. And you mentioned too, and while you're saying that you don't use the words, and I like how you describe this, like someone committed suicide. You say they died by suicide. Is that right? And
Right?
explain to us why you've changed that, because I think there's a big distinction there worth making.
I didn't know that language until after he passed away. And so I would have said committed suicide up until he passed away. And so died by suicide, the reason why that's so important to say it that way is because our words matter. Our words carry weight. Our words have consequences. And so the word committed is a word we attach to phrases like committed a sin or committed a crime or committed murder. And all that word does is heap shame and blame onto the shoulders of the person who died. I really, truly believe that this was not Andrew's fault. He did not choose this. He was overwhelmed with pain. It's a pain. Suicide is a pain problem. Most of the time there's been studies done on people that have attempted suicide and survived, and they have said that the instant that they attempted, they regretted it. It's a pain problem. They don't want to die. They just want their pain to end. And I will never understand what it was like for Andrew in those moments leading up to his death. And so I can sit back in that place of, I have no idea. I have no idea what he was experiencing. I have no idea what it was like to be him. I have no idea the unbearable psychological pain that he was in, where suicide felt like the only solution. And so I choose to say died by suicide. And I feel like that phrase clearly sends the message that the death was the result of an underlying physical illness, not a decision. And it's so important, even for my children, to grow up with that perspective. Like, your dad didn't choose this. He didn't want this. He would have never wished for this. He would be so shocked if he was here today and I told him this is what happened. And so for them to have empathy and compassion for their dad in his illness, like, his brain was sick, he had mental illness, and this was not a choice.
Mm. You just answered my next question. I was going to ask how you've talked to your kids about this over the years, but I know that's probably changed, but that sounds like such a great way to kind of introduce it. Are there things that people did or said that are not helpful that we need to know about when you're walking this road?
I think people do and say a lot of things in grief
Yeah.
that are not helpful. Like, time heals all wounds, or like quoting some scripture. I think if you haven't walked through deep, deep loss and pain, you just don't understand. And so that's been helpful for me when people do say stuff like that. I'm like, oh, they just don't understand. Like, thank God they don't understand, because I would not want them to understand. I would not want them to be carrying this pain. Like, they just haven't walked through it. So how could they understand? I did not understand until I've walked through it. But I would say, the best thing to do for someone that is walking through grief is to just be present. Don't worry about having the right thing to say or not having the right thing to say. Like, just be fully present with that person who is hurting. And if you say the wrong thing, oh, well, like, they're going to have grace for you. I've had so much grace for people. And I'm so grateful that I feel like the Big C church and our community and our local church that my husband was the pastor of, like, their response was so beautiful. And the response was so so loving, and the response was so compassionate that I didn't have to deal with that very often. But I think that it all goes back to, I have no idea. I have no idea what it's like to be sitting in your own unique pain. Even with family members, grief is so unique. Like, my grief is very different than my son's grief. My grief is very different than my brother-in-law's grief. My grief is very different than my friend's grief. We're all grieving a different relationship and a different person. And so I think just having a lot of grace for everyone's unique grief journey, and not comparing grief journeys, and knowing that, like, pain isn't something you move on from. It's something that you move forward with. I will always carry this pain with me for the rest of my life. I will have this pain of my husband's death, and that pain will be just as confusing. It'll still have that pit in my stomach, elephant on my chest, this mysterious, elusive, confusing part to it, because I'll never understand it. I will never fully understand it. And so I will carry that pain with me for the rest of my life, but I can choose to build a beautiful life around it. And so that's been what I've been trying to do in my grief journey. I call it rebuilding beautiful. Like, I had this beautiful life that I loved, and that beautiful life died with my husband. And now I'm rebuilding a new life. And I really, truly believe it can still be beautiful, but that doesn't mean I don't have pain. And so I think understanding that people that are grieving, people that have experienced deep loss, still have that pain. So don't shy away from talking about that person that they loved. Like, I love it when people bring up Andrew and talk about Andrew and talk about memories of Andrew. Like, 1 year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, they still need you. They're still grieving. They're still carrying that pain. Like, don't forget about their pain. Don't forget about their grief, and don't assume that just because it's been 1, 2, 3, 4 years that they have moved on from it, because they're never going to move on from it. They're only moving forward with it.
Okay, as we wrap up, I was reading about his last sermon that he preached before he passed, and it was Mess to Masterpiece, I think was the title, which, we're called Pardon the Mess. And so I was reading a little bit about how you described what the sermon was. I'm like, good grief, this is like perfectly speaking into all we believe in on this podcast. But you said, he talked about, I'm reading from your book, he talked about how mess is the thing we all have in common. We are all a mess. None of us have figured out. We're all broken. All of us fall short. It's the mess that brings us together and draws God near. If we weren't all a mess, we wouldn't need God. First of all, that's just so profound. Yeah, we're all a mess. And I think that's what it was so encouraging. Just come together and live authentically, and bring the ugly and the hard and the difficult, right? And the Lord, he's so good. And Andrew goes on to say this. It sounds like the challenge at the end of a sermon was this. And this is what I kind of wanted you to leave us with and encourage us. And he said, tune into what God is already trying to do in you. God's at work within us. We can stop trying to fix our messes on our own. None of us have arrived. We're all becoming. We're all a work in progress. We're all a masterpiece in the making. We have all sinned, fallen short, and need a savior. And I just thought, amen and amen. What's your encouragement for those of us that are listening or struggling or living with somebody struggling with this to embrace the mess?
I would just say, keep finding ways to live with the pain, that living with the pain is possible. And I am so sorry for your pain. I am so sorry that you are walking through this horrible, difficult season. And I would just want you to know that you are not alone, and that God sees you, and that God's with you, and that you have people that love you, that are surrounding you, and that it is possible to still have a beautiful, meaningful life despite the overwhelming pain.
Kayla, your book is awesome. It's called Fear Gone Wild, a story of mental illness, suicide, and hope through loss. How else can people catch up with you? Remind us the name of the blog again as well.
Yeah, so we have a family blog and shop. It's called godsgotthis.com. We sell wristbands and t-shirts and coffee mugs, and it's really a family affair, a thing that we do together. And then my Instagram handle is the best place to find me, and that's just Kayla Stoecklein.
Awesome. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. It was such an honor.
All right, a huge thanks to Kayla for coming on the show today. She's just got a great word. She's got a ministry that she never wanted, but she is sure walking the road well. I hope you're encouraged during this. I hope that if you are struggling in any way with your mental health, that you will get the help you need. There are professionals. There is a suicide hotline. There are friends and family, churches that want to love you well. And so do that as we walk through the end of September, but National Suicide Prevention Month. It's just important that we think through these issues and we're deliberate and intentional. So I'm glad you're with us today. I know your days are busy, so as always, thank you for joining us as we pardon the mess.